thank you to Lisa and the Fellowship of Free Thought for hosting us and welcoming us. And I have to give a little bit of credit to Dr. Shafi as well for sort of inspiring just sort of the idea of this as well. So he actually convened a little mini interfaith sort of colloquium several months ago where he had invited some local religious leaders and said, what can we do to promote interfaith sort of conversations within our different organizations? And I thought about that and I said, well, step one, maybe Dr. Shafi, if you're free. So here we are, and you know, this is really, I think, just a really good opportunity for all of us, and myself included, to just learn a little bit more about you and about some of the experiences that you've had. And one of the things that has been a focus for me personally is whenever I've been able to interact with or share dialogue with people from different sort of cultures or different faiths, I've always been interested in what are the things that we have in common, right? And so before we can get to that point, I guess we'll start off with just finding out a little bit more about your background. So we know that you're very involved here in this area and you're doing a lot of amazing things. But where did you come from? How did you get to this point?
It's first of all, thank you, Zach, and thanks, Lisa. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. It's a long story, and obviously we need to focus on what's most relevant to us at this point. But let me just talk about the why. Let me just talk about the issue that happened last year, because that sort of puts the context around why am I here today. And what happened last year was that I've been involved with our county Republican Party for many years, and since I became a citizen in 2009. And last year I was elected as the vice chair of our Tarrant County Republican Party with a near unanimous vote. And there was one person in the party who dissented from that vote, and then she started a public movement to oust me from that position because I happen to be a Muslim. And that really brought a lot of discussion in public. And she didn't. But prior to all that, when that person started that movement within the Republican Party, she didn't gain any traction whatsoever. So then she brought it into public domain, and within a day, the media picked it up and then sort of ran with it, and it eventually became national news. But without going into all the details, but throughout that period, which went on for about 8 or 9 months, I had solid support from the Republican Party, the entire leadership, the elected officials, rank and file members, and eventually it did come to a vote, and I can talk about why it even came to a vote, and I won that vote again for the second time. So it was clearly put to rest that kind of religious discrimination has no place in our country, in our party, or in our politics. But that actually, as tough as it was for me and my family to go through that, I think in the end it was a lot of good came out of it. And this kind of session that you had kindly invited me to is one of the positive outcomes of that. And I've done several of these kind of town halls or meetings with different groups to talk about the role of politics and role of religion in our society here. And I'm happy to talk about any of the aspects of it, but I wanted to give that background, which tells you why Zach invited me here, and then go on to answer specific questions. So in terms of my own background, I actually was born in India and grew up in Pakistan, and I came to the US in 1990. And after doing my surgical training on the East Coast in New Jersey and Philadelphia, we moved to Texas in 2003, and I've lived here since then. My wife and I have been married now for 27 years, and we have 3 kids, 2 of whom go to school here at UTD campus. I still work as a surgeon, but in 2009, when I became a naturalized citizen, I decided to start looking for ways to give back to the community and the country that has given us so much. And I want to talk a little bit about how I got here to the US. And in that process, I decided where I could be most effective was through local community and local politics. And that's how I really got involved. In 2011, I ran for City Council of South Lake. I lost that election. In 2014, I ran again, and I won that election, and again in 2017. And then, through my service to our community and the Republican Party is what I feel is the best use of my time and interest.
Sure. So, what was that decision like of coming to this country?
Yeah.
Right? So, and why? Like, so what drew you to the United States?
What drew me to the United States is what draws a lot of immigrants to the United States, which is freedom, which is opportunity, which is liberty and justice. Now, we live in very cynical times. And we feel that some of those words have, liberty and justice and those kind of things have lost their meaning. And we start taking a lot of those for granted. I am going to tell you a couple of stories that should tell you why we should not take those things for granted, which also will tell you why I truly believe that America is and remains a beacon of hope for the rest of the world. So I'll tell you two specific stories. For those of you who are familiar with the history of Indian subcontinent, it used to be one country, and it was ruled by the British for about 200 years. And when they left in 1947, they divided the country into two. Muslim majority areas became Pakistan, and Hindu majority areas stayed on as what is now the country of India. And then Bangladesh used to be part of Pakistan, but then it separated into a third country. So India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh was one country, which was divided along religious lines into these new countries. And as soon as that happened, and around that time, a lot of violence broke out on both sides of these artificially created borders. In Muslim majority areas, Hindus were persecuted. In Hindu majority areas, Muslims were persecuted. And by some estimate, it was one of the most violent incidents in the history of mankind. About 1 million people were killed, driven by religious hate and religious bigotry. 10 to 15 million people were displaced. So both my parents happened to, obviously they were Muslims, but they happened to live in the part of the country which became part of India. Now their families had lived in perfect harmony with their Hindu neighbors for decades, but overnight they lost everything, and they had to move out of their homes. And eventually they made their way to Pakistan. So religious, dealing with religious hate and bigotry is not new to our family, unfortunately. In that incident, so my parents was one of those 10 to 15 million people who lost everything, migrated, and started all over again in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, interestingly speaking, they were always considered an immigrant. Now, technically they were immigrant, but they were Muslims, so they should have been treated as full Muslims, but they were always considered as a separate group. So technically I was born an immigrant. So that's one incident. Now in Pakistan, they were able, through education and hard work, they were able to build a life for themselves. But by the time I came of age, which was in the mid-70s, and again, some of you may know this history, and this is the second story I want to tell you about why we should not take our freedoms here for granted. I grew up under a brutal military dictatorship that took power from an elected government in 1977. So I've personally seen censored papers. Like I've personally seen newspapers printed out with sections blacked out. Complete censorship of press, complete censorship of TVs and radios. Police was an instrument of oppression for the dictator. Police officers would come, they would kidnap, torture, and kill the political opponents of the dictator. For 10 years, not 10 years, maybe about 6 or 7 years, we lived in a home which was right across from the police station. And we had clear instructions from our parents, never make eye contact with a police officer, never cross that street and go to that building. And so that's the state of fear that we lived in. And that continued for a decade until that dictator, died in a plane crash. So coming from that kind of environment where everything is tightly controlled by a dictator-run government to coming to the U.S. was a breath of fresh air. And to this date, I feel very blessed to be, part of this country. One little anecdote I'll tell you is that, which I didn't realize at that time, I left Pakistan for the US on July 4th, 1990. So I've saved that old passport with the exit visa stamp on it from Pakistan from July 4th. And at the time, obviously, I didn't know the significance of the date, but now it's a reminder to me every year that we celebrate July 4th for a second reason. It marks the beginning of a personal journey for us as well.
Interesting. So when you came here, obviously comparing what the United States was like versus what Pakistan was like was clearly a breath of fresh air. One of the things that was happening here in the United States about that time, during the 1980s and sort of culminating in the 90s, was sort of the rise of evangelical Christianity, where Christianity was becoming much more politically active and powerful. Did you have any sense of the United States as an overtly Christian country, or did you see the United States as secular, and by which I mean religiously neutral? Like, what was your perception as you were coming to the country at that point?
So the answer, I would probably talk about the present. How do I view the United States as is it a religious country or is it a secular country? And I think it's both. So it depends on which area you're talking about. Now, going back to 1990, when I first arrived here, I will tell you another interesting anecdote. In a country like Pakistan, where whenever you have to fill out any kind of application form, whether it's for college admission or school admission or job application or passport, you have to declare your religion on it. And based on that declaration, you could be persecuted, and some of the persecution would be very overt and some of it would be very covert. So there were, for example, certain groups, religious groups, which were denied opportunities to pray, which were actively denied jobs and admissions to colleges. So compared to that, coming to the US, where really you never had to declare your religion anywhere on any of the forms that you had to fill out, was just liberating. It's a liberating experience that it didn't matter what your religion was. It didn't matter what your ethnicity was. It didn't matter where you came from. It only mattered where you were going. And that's another beauty of our country, is that you will hear me refer to the US as our country because that's how I feel. So in our country, it matters not where you're coming from, it only matters where you're going. So that is a huge difference between the US and rest of the world. And we may think that rest of the world also feels the way we do. I will tell you that is absolutely not true. Okay. So the question about religion, so from that standpoint, I feel like religion has never been a barrier or has never been imposed upon me. Now, fast forward to my public life over the last 10 years, our country is predominantly Christian. That's great. I mean, I have no, that's just how it is. This is the society that's how it is. I go to many meetings, whether they're public meetings or professional society not as much on professional society meeting, but public and political meeting, which open with the prayers, and I think that's fantastic. Sometimes the prayers are neutral or non-denominational. Sometimes they are purely Christian prayers. But I've also been to the meetings where they have encouraged other religions to come and say their prayers. So what I've told our kids and the way I feel is that, listen, no religion has monopoly over the truth. So take your blessings from whichever God is willing to bless you. So that has been my approach. So I respect everybody's faith or everybody's religion, and I think it's great if that helps them root their moral values or their code of conduct, and provides them some parameters to guide them. Where it becomes a problem is when you start trying to impose it on others. And my feeling even to date is that I think in our country we have systems that prevent people from imposing others' values on you. Sometimes you have to fight for those freedoms, but we have the framework and we have the rules and laws on the side of religious liberty.
Very good. I also want to ask about your experience of 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
So that was it was a formative moment for the country.
Yes.
It was also a very formative moment for the atheist community. You may have heard of Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and some of these other atheist writers. They were inspired to start writing very pointed critiques of religion, not just Christianity, but also Islam, in the aftermath of 9/11. And when they did so, it caused a sort of a crystallization of atheists and humanists who had sort of always been in the country and had not felt so much pressure to identify themselves as much or to meet with each other, very much like what we're doing now. And so you can, at least within the atheist humanist community, you can look back at 9/11 and say that was a watershed moment for us. It sort of put pressure on us to start acting a different way. Was there a similar reaction to that within the Muslim community that you experienced?
Absolutely. I think overall, as a nation, 9/11 was a Pearl Harbor for our generation, and and the best way to say that is, or best way to confirm that is, everybody remembers where they were when 9/11 happened. Just like everybody remembers when Kennedy was assassinated or when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So 9/11 is a watershed moment for the entire country. Now, it affected different communities in a different way. For the Muslim community, it was particularly tragic because a handful of terrorists and violent people hijacked the name of Islam and Muslims for their personal purposes. And in the process, they have left a legacy for the rest of the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world to deal with. I mean, think about that. It's a handful of people who conducted some violent attacks in the name of a religion which tarnished the name of the entire religion. Having said that, I also feel, so that has affected the Muslim community in the US especially in a very negative way, and the Muslim community has been under a microscope from all sorts of groups, including that now that we have learned over time, illegal surveillance by some law enforcement authorities. So that is obviously tragic, but at the same time, we have the laws and the system in place to prevent that from happening as those things come to light. I will give you one example of how it has affected the Muslim community in a negative way, and I'll give you another example of how it has helped the Muslim community in a positive way. So until 9/11 happened, personally, I never really thought about, what does it mean to be a Muslim in America. It was never an issue. In fact, that I thought we left that behind, when I left Pakistan. But 9/11 sort of brought it to the forefront again. So one example of where it has affected the Muslim community negatively, in 2014, the city of South, in where I live, where we have lived for many years, South Lake, a group of Muslims got together and they started a mosque in South Lake. They sent out invitations, and I was not part of that group, but obviously I helped them however I could. So they sent out invitations to an open house throughout the local community, to elected officials, to everybody. The only non-Muslim that showed up were 2 FBI agents. So at that time, I had a conversation with the FBI senior agent in charge of Dallas area. I had a coffee with him, and we were sitting and chatting, and he asked me how he thought Muslims feel, or he thought what is the best way to build relationship with the Muslim community. And to give him credit, because that's honestly what he was asking, because how do we build law enforcement, build more credibility with Muslim community? I said, well, the best way to do it is just the way you would do it with any other group. Do you send your FBI agents to the churches? Do you send FBI agents to synagogues? So if you don't do that, then don't treat the Muslim community any differently. So that was on the negative side. On the positive side, it has forced the Muslim community to become more open and to become more involved and try to become more integrated in the mainstream community. And again, to give credit to President George Bush, one of the first earliest things he did the week of 9/11 was he went to a mosque and clearly stated that as a policy, our fight is not with the Muslim community or Muslims or Islam, our fight is with the terrorists. So that way a lot of positives have come about. Yes, people like myself had to think about our identity one more time, but then such is life. So.
Yeah. So a few years after that happened, there was a study done out of the University of Minnesota. It was in 2006, I think. And it's somewhat infamous, at least within our community, where we did a lot of reporting on it, where they were asking people, Americans, which types of religious groups best fit their vision. You may have heard about this.
Yep.
Yeah. And the 2 groups at the bottom, and these 2 key questions. So which group best represents, or least represents, your vision of American society, as well as a member of which group would you least be happy with your son or daughter marrying?
Yes.
It was Muslims and atheists right at the bottom,
Yeah.
kind of together, right at the bottom. And sort of at the time, we would remark on this and say, look, they think we're as bad as the Muslims. And so I hear what you're saying with sort of doing open houses and being sort of forthright, and I've definitely seen that within the local Muslim community, and I kind of feel of 2 minds. So on the one hand, I think it's great to do that, but I also feel badly that it's felt like it's necessary to do that, and I wish it weren't that necessary. And part of what we've done, the Atheists and Humanists, is do a lot more outreach into the community, in part because of that as well, because we want to change that perception. A couple years ago, they did a follow-up on that study, and it showed that the atheists had moved higher, but Muslims had not. Is it your sense that there are gains that have been made by non-religious people that Muslims are still not enjoying, that you think is going to take longer for Americans in general to feel comfortable with Muslims representing them?
Yes. So the question is, how does the larger society feel about Muslim Americans, and what can be done to change that? So clearly, 9/11 put the Muslim American community in a terrible light, like I just mentioned, but if you step back and look at the larger history, longer history, going back 200 years, it's not anything new. So if you go back and read some of the stuff that happened right around the time of independence of our country, in fact, there's a statement from George Washington that clearly was said to protect the Jewish community in America at that time, in which he clearly stated that there is every religion is part of America, and there's no discrimination based on religion. And I forget the exact words, but that was said in the context of anti-Semitism that was prevalent at that country. So even from that time, from the time of the founding fathers, they were very clear that there's no religious test of being an American. But having said that, our country does have a terrible history of racism, bigotry, hate, from slavery to Irish were persecuted, and Polish were persecuted, and Jews were persecuted, and we had an act of Congress that excluded Chinese Americans of Chinese origin from owning property and owning certain businesses, and then we put Japanese Americans in internment camps. We pulled them out of their homes and put them in camps while their sons were serving the U.S. military in the Second World War. So we do have this terrible history of bigotry in our country. But having said that, we also have this wonderful history of overcoming those acts of hate and violence. And sometimes it has taken us, several decades to overcome that. But our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, provides that framework to overcome those acts of bigotry. So there are 2 points I want to make here. Number one, I feel very proud to be an American, but that's not to say that America is perfect. America is far from perfect. But what makes America unique in the entire world is that we continue to strive for perfection. We don't take our imperfections and say nothing can be done about it. We look at our imperfections and we say, okay, what can we do to overcome them? And we continue to strive for achieve that perfect union. The second thing I want to say is that in that, going back to the, what does it mean for Muslims? So Muslims just simply in that long history of persecution simply happen to be the most, the current group of, facing that kind of discrimination. But this is one way of looking at it, is that we have the entire history in front of us, so Muslims should know exactly what they need to do. And part of that is being more involved with the mainstream community. So I'll give you one. So having talked about the negative side, let me talk to you about the positive stories. So when I decided to run for the city council, that was back in 2009, I became a citizen, and then I started volunteering for these positions. And also that was the time in my life and career where I was more established. I had the ability to start giving back. So when I decided to run for the city council, many believed that it was not possible for a Muslim to win an election in America, especially in Texas. Especially in Tarrant County, especially in the city of South Lake.
Right.
And so there were people who believed that, and there were also people who believed that I was doing a disservice to the Muslim community by stepping up, because literally I was told in as many words that we just want to fly under the radar. We don't want to be noticed, just let us live our lives, pay our taxes, take care of our kids, go to our jobs. By you running for an office puts a spotlight on the entire Muslim community, and there will be repercussions for the rest of us. And obviously I didn't disagree with either one of those thought processes, and I ran for the office, and I went on to lose that election. So when I lost that election, those naysayers emerged again and said, "We told you so. We told you that it was not possible for a Muslim to win an election." But I still didn't believe them, because I have, one of my interests is reading about U.S. history, the independence, especially around the time of independence and around the time of Civil War. So I didn't believe it, because I really felt that the foundation of the country is very strong and is very it does not, the foundation of the country is solid. The principles that we are based upon are solid and positive for everybody. So I ran again in 2014. And again, the same kind of naysayers emerged. And there was some stuff that I had to face because of my religion. But at that time, in 2014, I ran against the same opponent on similar issues. At that time, I was opposed by the sitting mayor of town. I was opposed by every mayor of town going back 3 decades, former mayors. I was opposed by the entire elected school board and several of the current city council members. And I won that election. So on election night, and this is what I want you to remember, on election night, my speech consisted of 3 words: only in America. Only in America is it possible for a brown Muslim immigrant who speaks with an accent to win the support of his fellow Americans based solely on his actions, on his own credentials, and not on anything else. I can assure you that in a large part of the world today, I would not be elected to an office because I didn't belong to the right ethnic group, because I didn't belong to the right religion, or because I didn't have the right pedigree. So only in America is it possible for us to overcome all those kind of divisions that I still call the old world. So what is the lesson for Muslim Americans? The lesson for Muslim Americans, and for any group that feels that they're being persecuted and not getting their due place in the society, is to step up. The system will support you, but you have to step up. Nobody's going to give it to you on a silver platter. You got to go earn it. When I talk to Muslim Americans, this is what I tell them, especially the immigrants. You guys all are familiar with Emma Lazarus, right? The poem at the Statue of Liberty. It talks about how, send me your tempest tossed to our shore. This is the Golden Gate. She refers to America as the Golden Gate. So what I tell the immigrants is that you're standing at the threshold of a Golden Gate. It is within your power to cross that threshold and be fully integrated into the society. Once you start looking at yourself, when you look at the mirror, what do you see? Do you see a brown Muslim immigrant who speaks with an accent, or do you see an American? Do you see yourself as somebody who's persecuted and a victim, or an American with full rights and responsibilities and believe that you can achieve whatever you want to achieve? When you start, the first person you have to convince is your own self. So when you look at the mirror and you can see yourself as an American, that's when things will start to change. For every group that is persecuted, whether it's Muslims or Catholics or Jewish or humanist.
Sure. Great. So looking forward, one of the challenges that yet remains, I guess, for Muslim Americans is just the simple fact that most Americans are woefully ignorant of what Islam even is. Most people surely don't even know that there's more than one form of Islam, right?
Yeah. 72 to be exact.
Yeah. And most people probably aren't aware of the 5 pillars and what they are. But one of the 5 pillars is charity, right? Service. And just sort of looking at the things that we do here as well as humanists, that's something that we are focused on as well. are there any, aside from maybe that one, that very obvious one, are there any other sort of common values that exist between Muslims and potentially humanists? And maybe even Christians and Jews and other people as well. Like, what are some of the things that we all identify with?
There's so many common elements across all our people, but this is what I generally say when I want to make that point. So I trained as a trauma surgeon. So one of the things that brought us to Dallas area was because I really wanted to work at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. It's, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a big county hospital, and it's one of the busiest trauma centers in the country. When I say trauma center and trauma surgery, what means is we took care of patients who had terrible injuries after car crashes, or victims of shooting and stabbing and all kinds of serious injuries. So I've taken care of many people. So there was a patient who once showed up, and I forget how he got hurt, but he needed surgery, and I happened to be the surgeon on call. So I went there to see him, and one of the things that we do as part of our care for these injured patients when they're brought in by EMS is you have to strip them and examine them from head to toe to make sure that you're not missing any wounds or injuries. So we strip the guy and we examine him from head to toe, and we find some tattoos on him. A big tattoo on his chest which said "White Power."
Oh.
So we just ignore it and do what we need to do. But a point came where it was clear that he was going to need surgery. Now it was emergent surgery, but it was not something that needed to be done immediately. Like he could have waited a couple of hours. And the guy was awake. The patient was awake and alert, and I could communicate with him. So I went and talked to him, and I said, this is who I am. This is what we have found. This is what you need done. And I said that, look, I can see what's on what your beliefs are. Would you like? I'm the surgeon on call. Would you like me to call one of my partners who is a white Caucasian? And he said, Doc, just take care of it.
I'm sorry, he said what?
He said, Doc, just take care of me. And we took care of him. And this is what I tell people. You talk about common elements. Whether your skin is white, brown, black, yellow, red, or any color, whatever it is on the outside. Whenever I have put my scalpel to the skin and cut underneath the skin, we all bleed red.
So we all have,
need I say more?
Yeah. So we all have.
So the point is that we have these superficial differences, and we got to be able to look beyond them. We all hurt the same way. We all have the same fears for our children. We have the same aspirations for ourselves and our families. We all aspired for the same things. So So that's what we need to focus on. So to me, your faith is something, like I said earlier, it's whatever moral compass you want to use, whether it's religion or no religion or a book of some sort or no book of some sort or your own free thought, it's your moral compass for your behavior.
Sure.
By all means, go for it. Just don't try to impose it on anyone else.
Yes.
And as long as you do that, you will find that there's much more in common than anything else.
Yeah, we're all human beings after all.
Yep. So remember this, we all bleed red.
So looking forward to the future then, just to close this up, what are some of the things that those of us here in the humanist community, in the atheist community, is there anything that we might do that might be of special significance or might be advantageous for us if we partnered with the Muslim community or Muslim organizations? I'm just wondering, we're both somewhat marginalized within the culture. Is there something that we can do together to help strengthen each other?
So I have one thing I'll caution every group that feels persecuted. And again, I'm talking about in the context of our country here in America. It's vastly different in other countries. I think we've got to be very careful that we don't develop that victim mentality, that the larger society is out there to persecute me. And how can I fight that persecution? How can I avoid that persecution? I'll give you a better path. Your better path is to join that larger society without having to give up your values or your identity. So a lot of time people ask me that, how can you be a Republican? You know? And my answer to that is, first of all, Republican Party in reality is not what you see in the media. Yeah. Republican Party, what I've found is always welcomed me with open arms, and I've found opportunities in there that I couldn't even have imagined. But part of the, all right, so to be very candid with you, even to this date, when I go to some of these events like today, or if I'm just going to a political event or a public event or even to a Republican club meeting, part of me, when I reach there, I park my car and I sit in the car and I say, why the hell do I have to go to this thing? Let me just turn around and go home and be with my family and just, it's, why am I doing this? But every time I have stepped out of my car and entered that room, I've been welcomed with open arms and I've had a great time. And I've made new friends and met new people and just keep crossing those barriers. So what I've realized is the biggest barrier that I have to overcome is the one that I've created for myself in my mind. So if we start believing that the world is out there to get you, that's what you're going to believe. But if you believe that the world is not out there to get you, but the world out there is full of opportunities, then you're going to start looking for those opportunities. And what I have learned in my experience is that as long as you step up to volunteer for the right reason, you will be welcomed with open arms. So going back to answer your question, what can Muslims and humanists and other groups do? My answer to them is step up and serve. Step up and serve the larger community. Don't worry about who is who. And as long as you do that, we'll all come out ahead. And my life, I would say, or my public life and professional life has been an example of that. And that's what I hope. One of my hope for today, this gathering and the other gatherings that I've gone to, is especially focusing on those young folks at the back, Jacob and Utser and Asia, is to inspire these people. You can either look as a barrier as something that's going to stop you, or as a barrier that's going to make you stronger and you'll overcome that barrier. And I found that with perseverance and with hard work and with good intentions, you can overcome multiple barriers. I came to this country with very little. In fact, when I first arrived here, my net worth was negative because I had to borrow money to come here. And in that, I will tell you another story. I can tell you story after story after story. And I'm counting on you to stop me when the time is up. So the first year that I got here, I had borrowed some money to come here from some very kind people, and but I had to be very judicious about that money because it was all. I was a graduate student, tuition fee to pay. I couldn't get any scholarships because I was a foreign national. In any case, at one point, I clearly remember I went to the ATM machine and put my card in, punched in my not zip code, my PIN, and punched in $10 so I could go get some dinner. And I put the card in, and the machine did its thing, and I'm waiting, and then it spit out the card with this thing flashing on the screen, insufficient funds. That evening in Baltimore, Maryland, in the fall of 1990, I did not have $10 to my name. So I went hungry that night and many nights afterwards.